Hi, I'm Stanley Goldberg, host of the Inquiring Mind podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you're new here, I release 2 episodes a week with a variety of fascinating guests, and I would appreciate if you would support my podcast by liking this video and subscribing down below. Thank you for your support, and now to today's guest. Peter Moskos, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. So before I'm going to try to frame it a little bit. You're a professor at John Jay College, which is a CUNY. I'm a graduate of a CUNY. I went to Baruch. It's
Oh, did
just
you?
literally, well, not down the block, but in Manhattan. It's sort of down the block.
23rd and Lex.
Yes.
I before COVID, I played racquetball in Baruch, so I went there once or twice a week. I know it
well. And you are an expert on policing, and you've written a book which is now around 12 years old, Cop in the Hood. It's a fairly provocative title, but I like it. It's an interesting book. I read a lot of it last night, which was it was great.
I'm glad you liked
Policing.
it. It was less provocative 12 years ago because everyone got the Boys in the Hood reference, but
yeah. So policing is one of the most seminal issues in America today. I don't know if it was definitely more I guess important a year ago because of all the protests with the George Floyd and everything else. But I think it's still a very important question that we're facing in our country today. Can we just start with the very general question? What do you think is the state of policing in major cities today? And maybe if you want to focus in on New York City, because we both live in New York City, what do you see as the state of policing in New York today?
well, it's a tough time in policing right now. I think strangely, I think it's a little better in New York, not actually because of the state of policing, just sort of the resources of the city and the resources that the NYPD has. I'm more optimistic about New York City than other places like Baltimore right now. But the change in policing that was, I would say, a trend since Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson 2014, that really accumulated last year after the murder of George Floyd. Um, it's been dramatic, and at least judging by last year's rise in violence in America, it's been collectively it's been counterproductive. It's made cities more dangerous, um, and that's of course a sort of umbrella, simplistic view of things. And policing is local, and there are tons of other factors and variables involved. Um, but no, I don't think, especially last year, things did not get better. And yeah, I will see. I mean, the fact that like Eric Adams was elected mayor here is, I wish him the best. But it's just the idea that if you went back a few years ago, the idea that New York City was going to elect a former cop who made crime a major issue of the primary election, that he would get elected, that would have been incomprehensible a few years ago. So they're clearly, so perhaps the pendulum is sort of getting back to some point of normalcy, but what the extreme abnormal under the pendulum swing is it's shown somewhat in the defund movement, but the foundation of that being police abolition, this idea that police are a problem to be eliminated rather than at best a force for good, at worst a necessary evil, but faults and all, something that is a net benefit and essential basically to civil society. That debate got shifted so far to one extreme was, well, it was shocking at least, but also frustrating because I've been trying to deal with these issues now for 20 years and a lot of progress has been made. And it seems like nobody wanted to know or care about the incremental improvements that have been made over decades in policing. Substantial improvements, though, and all that. A lot of that just got thrown out of the window. So we'll see, but it's frustrating for people who have been involved in policing for a long time. And me, from an academic standpoint, I was a cop very briefly. Um, eh, to see the debate kind of go off the rails, and people suddenly declare themselves policing experts who really don't know what they're talking about. But that's where we are today.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is the fact that so something happens in Minneapolis, which is I mean, the horrible thing. George Floyd gets killed last summer, and uh, then there are protests all around the country, New York, Minneapolis, obviously, probably Chicago. All of these big cities have major protests. Um, but it's interesting that the blame for the police is not targeted towards maybe the Minneapolis Police Department. It's targeted to every police department in those major cities. So all of a sudden, the NYPD becomes public enemy number one, and I don't quite understand how one thing that happens in Minneapolis and it transfers to New York City.
That was interesting to uh, I mean, part of it, look, police present themselves as police collectively. They wear a uniform. So, on one hand, I can't blame the public for seeing police as a singular entity, um, and moving blame across, from Minneapolis to New York. That said, rational voices need to be heard a little bit and say, okay, um, that happened there. And the officer was charged and convicted. I think that's also important to point out. There was accountability, and justice in our flawed judicial system, but it worked in as much as it can work. And and here's the NYPD, faults and all. And look, it's a large organization. It has all the problems inherent to any large public organization, plus any problems inherent to policing. But by measures that we could quantify, that people, for good reason, say are important, um, by American standards, it was a good police department. And I say that looking at use of force, use of lethal force. Um, Arrests were declining, crime was at all unbelievable record lows, with fewer than 300 murders a year. Complaints were down. Um, if the issue is cops killing people, why are we focused on the department that does it the least, instead of saying, what are you doing right? And how can we transfer that to departments that are on the other end of the spectrum? There are departments out there, large ones, and they're all out west, which is interesting. And I'm thinking, not just to pick on them, but places like Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Albuquerque, Riverside, California, a lot of medium-sized cities out west, that have rates of use of lethal force that are 6, 7, 8, 9 times New York City's. Why are they shooting so many people? I don't know. I have some theories, but I don't know. But that's where the problem is. That's where the cops are shooting a lot of people. Maybe they're all justifiable. I don't think so.
What are the theories? I'm
Well,
interested to.
um, everything from greater geographical distance, less backup. New York cops always patrol in pairs, which is incredibly expensive and probably wasteful, but it probably also prevents the occasional shooting every now and then. And maybe that's worth it then. Um, uh, more uh, more guns out west, less restrictive gun laws, more meth, this kind of drug. I think all those things contribute. But they're also just maybe more of a culture of shooting. Like, there's less accountability. There's less pushback. A lot of those cities I mentioned are disproportionately non-Black. And perhaps white people just don't care when cops kill people. I don't know. That's a little bit glib, but at some point, I mean, police departments should be held accountable, and big city departments, like New York City has been held more accountable historically. I think that's made for a better police department. So I don't know all those reasons, but the idea that, but you have one department that was still is doing a pretty good job, but was just doing a better job. And I mean, I'm thinking of one person I know, a older female officer who is Black, and during the protest, and she just said, I'm standing there listening to some white girl who could be, she's ate of my daughter, um, yelling, telling me I'm racist. And I grew up here. I live here. Like, it was all because cops killed a man in Minnesota. Like, it just, at some level, it was a level of absurdity. She just couldn't like figure out what the hell is going on here. Um, and who knows? But it's not that the protests themselves led to more people shooting each other, but it did change policing, the response to everything that happened. I mean, the protests themselves do take cops off, cops off of what they normally do. Um, but it was more the political movement, the idea that the less police do, the better, and that there's sort of a push and a pull. The pull is officers saying, "Hey, that cop did what we were trained to do and got in trouble for it. So I'm not going to do that anymore because I don't want to risk my career or criminal prosecution." Um, I mean, not too long ago, I sort of used to joke a cop had to do something wrong to get in trouble. And now cops are getting in trouble when they're not doing anything wrong. That's a big switch. And when I say not doing anything wrong, I mean, usually I'm talking about a legal and necessary, perhaps, use of force that is criticized simply because cop used force. That's unfortunately that's why we have police officers, is because they might use force. If there was no force implied, threatened, or needed, then we should have other agencies do that job. So that was a big change. And then you get a push for less policing through changes in laws, and through prosecutors saying we're not going to prosecute broad swaths of crime. So, a lot of people who advocate for decriminalization of various things, which I'm not necessarily against. I mean, it depends on what we're talking about. But then they say, why aren't cops doing their job? Well, you told them not to do their job. If you take away the legal authority to stop somebody, don't be surprised when cops don't stop somebody for that. They can't. They need legal authority for their action, and especially for discretionary action. But it's almost a cliche that policing is a verb, but it's a question of what the cops actually do, and they do respond to directives and political pressure. So, recently there was a directive a month or two ago. The cops are no longer involved in illegal vendors enforcement in New York City. That may or may not be a good policy. It might. I like my Subway churros as much as the next person. That's a choice politicians can make, and maybe they should make it, but don't blame cops then for not enforcing it. I mean, these are things are explicitly told not to do anymore, and so they don't. Same thing with loitering for prostitution. That was changed at the state level. Well, I think that was unfortunate, but then if someone is soliciting customers and turning tricks outside your house, there really isn't much it's not a crime anymore. Well, the turning trick part technically would be, but the solicitation part. So, I mean, these are political choices. And often police get blamed for the choices that politicians have made. So,
Yeah, one of the most interesting things about the NYPD is, and I feel like a lot of people don't know, is it's what more minority than
it's majority minority.
minority, right? So, and it's mostly Hispanic that's within that majority minority, correct? So,
Yeah.
so when you have protesters yelling at them, calling them racist, and they go, "Well, yeah, exactly. I grew up here, and I'm sorry, but kind of look at the color of my skin. If you want to call me racist, we're going to play that game too." But the interesting thing is, I once talked to I spoke to a cop once. He showed me a body cam like footage of something he went through on like a typical kind of stop that he had. This woman had a busted tail light, and he stopped her. It was probably like 11 o'clock at night, someplace in Williamsburg in Brooklyn, and he pulls her over and very nicely comes up to her, goes, "Hi, ma'am, just wanted to let you know your tail light is out. And you can't." He wasn't gonna do anything about it. He was just trying to inform her of it. She gets out of the car, yells at him, calls him crazy, calls him racist over and over and over and over again. And she said, "If I were white, you would never stop me." And he was like, "No, I'm just trying to legit." And she slaps him. And I'm just like, well, if people kind of knew that this was not as uncommon as it,
Oh, every
uh,
cop has that story.
yeah, every cop has that story. And no, I'm saying if people knew generally that this is kind of the crap you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis on this job, maybe you would cut them some slack sometimes. And I think oftentimes when you meet police officers, especially NYPD, I kind of don't blame them at times for being cynical, depending on where they're stationed, because they kind of have to deal with this stuff regularly. And maybe on the first day you're not worn out by it, but by day 50 you're kind of like, I'm over this.
Well, yes and no. Well, cops are become cynical, perhaps both by nature and by job. Um, I wouldn't say it happens on a down, maybe it depends on where you work on a daily basis, but it does happen. Part of it is that it might have gotten worse recently, but that's not new. At some point, you just have to be able to have a thick skin and take
Yeah.
it. I mean, the irony is then that woman who wasn't going to get the ticket, I hope, got arrested. Um, but it's uh, so it is part of the job. Not saying it should be, and not saying it's fair, but I'm not, yeah, yeah, it happens. And when and cops have to be better than that. Um, the difference, I think, though, is then when it's when you see these documented instances of not getting support for when they don't mess up. That is what kills policing. Um,
Well, can you give an example of that? Like, what's a prominent maybe example of
well,
police following protocol and doing the right thing and them not getting the credit for it?
Well, a couple days ago in DC, when a cop punched a guy who had a gun, and the cops knew he had a gun. There were four cops. Um, I don't know DC's protocol on what are called fist strikes. I believe it's permitted, though I'm not certain. In Baltimore, I wasn't trained that way. So when I see a cop punch someone, New York cops can punch; they're allowed to punch, by the way. Uh, when I see a cop punch, I cringe just because I wasn't trained that way, and I don't think it's necessary to policing. But the guy has a gun.
Yeah.
To me, um, I know people. Why couldn't they get him under control? They couldn't. Okay, it's not easy. You try it. Um, whatever, whether it was the cop's fault or not, I don't think it is. But the guy was not under control, and he had a gun. Um, to me, the question is: once he was under control, did the cop stop punching him? And the answer was yes. It was very goal oriented. It was to get the guy in custody and control. And he punched him three times. And then he stopped. The guy, I don't know how you're supposed to get guns off people. You can say, well, he didn't have to, maybe not, but if he didn't, um, what are the odds that the cop would have been shot? Not high, but 1% is too high. The point is, like, nobody was seriously hurt. The guy had an illegal gun and he was arrested. In LA recently, there was a guy who grabbed a cop's gun, pistol whipped him, got in a gunfight with cops, and a cop who finally got him. And um, I haven't seen the video of that, but the cop who finally got the guy arrested was charged also with hitting him. Good God, the guy just tried to murder a cop, and the cop didn't kill him. You don't want to take chances. That's why you use force. Sometimes a little force used early is better. I don't want to say de-escalation. It depends on the situation. If there's someone in mental crisis, yeah, absolutely de-escalate. If the person is unarmed and time is on your side, you can take time. But when someone has a gun, you've got to. Time is not on your side. You want to end it quickly. Um,
Yeah.
So that, but so these cops are now getting in trouble for using force against armed suspects. And this is not crazy beating the guy when he's in cuffs kind of situations. Um, Police chiefs need to say, yes, it looked bad. It actually worked. Um, Sometimes bad tactics can work and good tactics can fail. You can't always judge it on the outcome. But when the outcome is good, which is no one seriously hurt, that matters.
Right.
Um, there was a, yeah, cops the other day shot someone in Baltimore. I don't know the full story. The guy had a gun. Cops shot him, and I think killed him. I'm not certain. It's not. Again, this is hypothetical. I'm not talking about that instance. But had the cop punched him earlier, and avoided the shooting, the cop would have gotten in trouble. Instead, someone shot, and it's not going to be a big issue. It shouldn't be a big issue. But the idea that cops don't use force is not correct. So it's when these type of things happen, when cops go, wait a second, if this turns ugly, I don't know what's going to happen and I might get in trouble. So you avoid discretionary policing. And now, again, to some people, that's a feature, not a flaw. Okay, maybe just let the drug dealer with a gun go about his business.
See what happens.
Yeah, I mean, but I think that's negligent. And certainly if I lived on that block, I wouldn't want it. And of course, the people who live on the block don't want that because presumably they called police in the first place. But yeah, when cops talk about getting support, it's well, some of it is there is crazy right wing extreme to policing as well. But a lot of it is simply, I'm doing my job. You have to back me up when there's a viral video if I did nothing wrong.
Yeah. I'm interested to get your take on. I've heard multiple takes on this, but a few years ago, the case of Eric Garner. Um, how what do you was that following police protocol? Was the cop wrong in that action? Can you tell like the story of Eric Garner?
Well, he was a serial Lucy seller. Um, he was selling loose cigarettes. He was a known entity at that level. He was not particularly, he wasn't a hardcore gangbanger type guy. But he was out, you know, it was a public order issue. He was a very large man. Um, I mean, it's a long story, and I wasn't there, so I kind of am hesitant to get stuff wrong because it was so many years ago. But cops were talking to him, and he decided, and cops were going to arrest him, and he decided he didn't want to be arrested, and then a cop jumped on him, brought him to the ground, used a chokehold, but did not. But Eric Garner was still alive after that. Anyway, and then Eric Garner died. There was a lot. I'm torn on what that cop did because when you have a lot of cops, it's the one who is most aggressive who sets the tone. Once the fight starts, the other cops have to get in. I say this without much confidence, which probably even shouldn't say it, but I just wish that the officer had waited a bit longer. Though, I mean, again, the video is long. It's not just those
Yeah.
seconds. But that's a quibble in a way. There was also great fault. The sergeant at the scene never took charge. The paramedics did not do a good job. He did not die in police custody. He died in paramedic custody. I mean, it was because of police action. I'm not saying that, but there was a lot of. It was not a well-handled situation at many levels. But I mean, cops are generally very supportive of that officer because it's not easy to get a large resisting man in custody. Um, some people say, well, he never should have been in custody in the first place. Again, that's a political choice. Maybe he should be allowed to sell untaxed loose cigarettes in Staten Island. I mean, but at some point we have rules and laws. But it had a major, and I guess the follow up, and partly because it was in Staten Island, is the officer was not criminally charged. He was, however, after many years, fired. by the NYPD. I forget what year that was.
A couple of years ago, I think.
More than a couple now. But I forget when. I want to say like 2011. Could be that long ago.
Really?
I think it was pre-Ferguson. That's why. Um, there's moving away from that specific case. Again, I think there was much to learn in the Sentinel review concept. Like, how could have this been handled better? But when we saw this for many years, it's interesting. We haven't been seeing it this year. The cops shoot and kill about 1,000 people a year. I think, based on the high numbers in cities where cops shoot a lot of people, I think we could reduce that without any danger to cops or public safety to probably about 600 with better training, recruitment culture, and that's even without changing gun laws or looking at drugs and that type of thing. That's that's just me guessing. I don't know. But some of those are not necessary. There are probably, I don't know, let's say a dozen criminally bad police involved killings every year, roughly. I mean, give or take, whether it's actually 5 or 20, but it's not going to be more than 2 dozen. So I'm categorizing things here. First of all, there's the shootings that are, and people never want to address this fact, but the shootings that are actually good. And I don't mean that in the police justified sense. I mean that in the moral sense, an active shooter situation, someone who was about to kill their girlfriend, the terrorist. We sometimes pay police to kill people. We ask them to do that. It's a big ask. But they're supposed to do that in certain situations. They're very rare, mind you, but they're not, but it happens. So the goal is not to have zero. The goal is to have fewer. Then there's the bulk of categories, which is someone is a threat and cops kill that man usually. Because they don't want to get, because someone faces the risk of getting killed. I mean, that's the, someone shooting at you, you shoot back. That's the bulk of them. And then you get sort of what are sometimes coined lawful but awful, the ones that may or may not be presentable. So, suicide by cop is a tough one. Well, it turns out the gun was, a replica. Well, yeah, but there's no way to know that. You can't ask cops to roll the dice with their life on that. So, but suicide cop often ends up looking bad because the person turns out not to be a threat, but they wanted cops to shoot them, and they often get their wish. But there are ones where you just go, man, it's not criminal. I understand. Yes, the person did that, and I wasn't there, but I can't help but think, had I been there, I would not have shot that person. That's another good chunk. And then you get the ones that are just truly horrible. I mean, there's one, and it was in Oklahoma, I'm pretty sure, where there's a suicidal guy holding a can of lighter fluid. And the cops knew it was lighter fluid. And they said, put down the lighter fluid. And then they shot and killed him. And I just go, what? And I mean, there are actually a lot of these ones, and everyone involved there was white, so it didn't sort of get national media traction, but it was really horrible shooting. I hope the cops got in trouble for that one. But my point is, they happen, once a month, maybe a bit more, but they happen every month or more, and it's a big country. And when those happen, we need to figure out what went wrong and hold police accountable. But the idea that we go from outrage to outrage, it's not productive, because it's going to happen again next month. I guarantee it. Now, whether it becomes a big news story is another matter. We can't abolish policing because a cop fucked up. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And I am saying, yeah, hold them responsible. But at some point you have to look at, and it's tough because we're not dealing with real people and human lives. And you can say, well, it's an aberration. It doesn't matter if it's you. There was the case of that guy crawling in the hallway. Was it in Las Vegas or Mesa or somewhere? Cops were giving him an orders and he was complying. And then he kind of reached to pull up his pants and got killed. It was a horrible shooting. That would fall under the lawful but awful category, I think. you have to, as it sounds almost amoral to say, you have to disassociate yourself from it a bit and say, how can we reduce these? In 1970, and I could actually pull up the number if you want the exact one because I forget it. But cops in New York shot something like 300 people. And killed well over 100, I think 150, though I'm not looking at the numbers, in 1 year, every other day, basically. And in more recent years, it's been somewhere between like 5 and 10. That is a huge reduction, and it did not happen by accident.
And considering the fact that the population grew in that time too, right? Like the
Yeah,
population increased. It might have been
a
marginal
bit, but that's still a marginal increase, and this is a 90% decrease in
yeah,
the number
exactly.
of shots fired by cops. The decrease happened mostly in the 70s, but the other trend, by the way, is shootings reflect violent crime. If there are more people shooting, cops are going to get involved in more situations where they shoot somebody. That's another trend. Shootings went up in the late 80s with the crack. Police involved shootings went up in the late 80s when general shootings went up. So the two trends, there's sort of the one that reflects crime, and when, as the US murder rate went down, cops shot fewer people. But the other is this even greater decrease that happened mostly in the 70s, but also continued. And I don't know if it got attention then. I mean, I was born in 71, so I wasn't, conscious of it going on. But if you can reduce those, yeah, if you but it would happen because of people. First of all, people cared. I don't know if it's in my book. I think it is. There's one of the guys I worked with. He went on the job in 1968. He retired with 33 years on. He had been a cop for longer than I'm alive. And he would tell stories about policing in Baltimore's Eastern District in the late 60s and early 70s. And he said, man, Pete, he said, I shot at a lot of people. I never hit anybody. And he said, you didn't even have to fill out any paperwork. You would just go and buy more ammo. This was before Tennessee versus Garner. This was the stop or else shoot era. That changed. If nothing else, cops suddenly, the first step was, hey, when you shoot your gun at somebody, yeah, we got to know about it. That was step one. But some of these were easy steps, but it had a huge impact. Some of it was, again, better training. Some of it was what became Tennessee versus Garner actually started as NYPD policy in the 70s, which said you can't shoot someone just for fleeing. There's got to be an actual threat. Of course, police officers predicted doom because that's what cops do, but it actually made policing much safer because some people were quite happy to just run away. But if you shoot at them, they might shoot back, and occasionally one of those bullets will hit you. Certainly, medical treatment got astoundingly better in the following decades. Cops started wearing bulletproof or bullet-resistant vests. All those things contributed to officer safety. But the point is, the whole thing was toned down. And it's like none of that matters. I mean, honestly, in a city like New York, given American culture and the guns prevalent, it's unrealistic, I think, to say that police in New York City could or should shoot fewer people. But that doesn't mean they won't screw up occasionally. But we can approach this rationally and save lives, or we can just sort of be outraged and roll the dice with what that means to policing and public safety.
Yeah, what I really find interesting is there's this conversation with Defund the Police, which might be top 3 worst logos or mottos for any campaign ever. But I mean, it gets people's attention, not for nothing. But defunding the police, and I'm a fairly young person. I'm 24 years old, but I've never quite seen 3 words divide people so much in my life. Defund the police was one person telling me, well, it's not actually defunding the police, they're just redirecting funds. And then the other side would be,
no, we mean defund.
yeah, screaming bloody murder, and saying this is the worst thing to ever happen to police. And in my opinion, right, if you want police to do a better job, technically, wouldn't you give them a little more money? Maybe this is overly simplified, and I'm sure it is, but you give them a little more money for better training, perhaps. Then I don't know, do some mental health checks. I don't know if that's common in police
No,
departments.
it's not common. And
And
I
I
think it could
and I
be.
would imagine when you deal with that much stress on a day-to-day basis, you kind of need to have some kind of relief for your stress. And wouldn't that, like, mental health checks would be necessary? Am I wrong in that?
Um, yeah, I mean, no, you're not wrong. It's boy, when you get into things like that, it's tough because you want police to admit when they need help. But the problem is if they admit they need help, it can often mean the end of their police powers. There needs to be some intermediate step where you can admit you're having issues, but they're not disabling. You can still do your
You're working
job.
through it. Yeah.
Yeah, you're working through it. And that it exists a little bit. Again, like many things, NYPD does a slightly better job with that. They actually do have a program called PAPA, that POPBA, I think, where cops can get help and they're sort of mysteriously transferred out of where they are, but it kind of is held under wraps, so it avoids a certain stigmatization. Most departments don't have that. And I will say, look, of the cops I worked with are mostly retired now, but not all of them. Uh, I would say it's funny that the guy who did 33 years, he somehow he was man, he had a good head on his shoulders. Um, he also confided in me before he retired. He's like, I've never gotten a complaint against me. I feel bad. Not a serious one. A lot of them are damaged goods, and I don't mean that they're not able to function. But yeah, the job changes you. Some of that is by design, hyper awareness. Um, but these are things that you're trained to have qualities that are part of the clinical definition of PTSD. Um, it took me longer after I was a cop to not be a cop than the time I was a cop for. I was there for less than 2 years, and it took more than 2 years before I could sit with my back, to the door of a restaurant or bar kind of thing, before I was willing to close my
Wow.
eyes on the subway with headphones on. Um, and
Was it just, I'm sorry, was it just time that got you over that?
yeah, it was just time. Maybe if I, probably a very change in scenery in life. I mean, my social life was different in Baltimore. It's a different city, so I don't want to take this analogy too far because but just as an analogy, it's um, perhaps akin to coming back from a soldiers. I'm thinking. I don't even want to make the analogy because it's not fair. But no, but everything was different. I finished my PhD at Harvard. I'm living in a different city, so all that stuff.
Yeah.
It was a very different environment, but still, the idea that yeah, if I close my eyes on the subway coming back from Baruch College, um, stay awake for that. But you know what? The odds are I'm going to make it back to Queens just fine. Yeah, perhaps someone will come on the train and stab me for no reason, but I'm willing to take that chance. Because, but that it took years before I was willing to take that chance. Looking in stores and making sure they're not being robbed when you go in. Actually, I still do that a little bit because it's pretty low effort. Um, but the job changes you. It has to. You must have hyper situational awareness. You're supposed to be on guard. Um, and then you combine that with the level of human misery, suffering, trauma, watching people die, babies killed, all that stuff. And it affects different people in different ways. I actually don't think that. I think that wasn't a part of the job that bothered me. And at some point, if you're going to stay there, it can't. Um, but it collectively it adds up. And then combined with the fact, and this is why I think last year was really tough for cops. Part of the deal is I'm not doing this job to die, um, but I am willing to put my life at risk for people I don't know, people I may not even like. I'm willing to run towards gunshots. It's a really big ask, and yeah, I know statistically cops aren't that likely to die on duty, but you're asking them to put themselves. It's not. I'm not dying because I made a mistake. I'm dying because I did my job, and I did it after swearing an oath to defend the Constitution. Um, you put all that together, and I want society to at least recognize I'm on the side of good. I'm not asking for a cookie, but just, you know, you don't have to overly appreciate it. I don't need to be thanked for my service or called a hero, but understand that if a bomb goes off in New York City, I'm going to go towards it. And who knows what's going to happen? There might be a second one. It that moral high ground sort of disappeared last year, where a lot of cops wondered again, because cops murdered a man in Minnesota. How did I suddenly become the bad guy? Um, why am I doing this then? If I'm actually part of,
A villain, not a hero in some
yeah,
regards.
if I'm a force of oppression defending systemic racism and white supremacy, screw it. Um, and so I mean that's why last year was very demoralizing for police, because they didn't quite understand, like, wait a second, what changed so quickly, that we suddenly became the focus of all this, all this negative attention. Um, so all that kicks in, but I forget what forget how I started about that.
Huh.
But yeah, but the job does change you. Oh, the mental health part. Um, yeah, the cop, again, I don't want to overstate it, but yeah, there's long-lasting psychological effects. How major they are depends on the individual. But it would be nice if that could be addressed. But honestly, I don't know what the alternative. I mean, I assume paramedics get some of this, but paramedics at least are still seen as the side. I mean, they got to deal with a lot of this, seeing the human. They see the same thing cops
Yeah.
do. And I don't know if I've never read anything about the effects of being a paramedic, but at least they're not put in a situation where they might have to shoot somebody. That helps matters. But there's such a larger disconnect now, and I think it's growing. And a lot of it, there's also a class. This is not about mental health, but just in general about um, policing as a culture. There are class differences. A lot of the criticism, and I think going back to a cop punching someone, comes from people who have never punched or been punched in their life, and it's just great. I'm happy for you, but that's not the world for a lot of Americans. And so to sort of deny, to live in a bubble, quite frankly, of safety, that other people don't have that privilege, and then criticize those who are trying to maintain public order, that also puts cops in an awkward position. And let me just throw in there, a lot of police unions don't help their cause. They're not serving the interests of their members by issuing stupid statements, endorsing Donald Trump for president, and representing a certain old guard, often a white old guard of policing, that a lot of people object to, and for good reasons. But and different police unions have different levels of rationality. Some I think are productive even, but certainly more productive than others. But it's the cops do sometimes bring them on themselves a bit. That is the public antipathy toward them.
Well, what was interesting in the first chapter of your book, that you mentioned the fact that most police officers lean conservative or are, and they actually poked fun at the fact that you were a liberal, and I assume you still are a liberal. And I think that's an interesting thing. Has there been a shift in how, in political affiliation or political ideology among police officers?
I don't think a great. My short answer, and I don't know, but I'm guessing I don't think so. I do. What's policing as minority representation increases, it's not that cops get less conservative, but they get less Republican. It becomes more nuanced. It's a different kind of conservative, more socially conservative and less politically conservative. So I think that changed. I think policing in many ways does reflect society in terms of which laws are enforced and so on, for good and for bad. I think it would be the benefit to police and therefore society if policing was more ideologically diverse. Last year is not going to help that at all. Um, I mean, look, there can be good and bad cops of any creed, race, religion, or gender, but I think diversity collectively is good. in all those categories, but that includes ideology. Um, it's not going to change. But but to understand policing, you kind of, especially if you don't have any, if you don't know anybody that voted for Donald Trump, I'm guessing here, but at least of white cops, Trump, I think it's safe to presume, got 80+% of the white police vote.
Yeah.
Though we don't know, but I mean, it might even be more.
I think that's a safe assumption.
Um, it's just, to understand policing, you have to understand that. And if you want to say, well, that means they're all evil, you can say that, but that's not going to help matters. And it's not true either. No matter how anti-Trump you are, and I'm pretty anti-Trump, to be clear. But it's it's an ideologically conservative organization. And at some point, look, it's law enforcement. Going back to, Adorno's authoritarian personality, there's probably some of that as well. It's certainly going to attract more conservatives than the Peace Corps. But it could still be more diverse. It could still, as a public institution, it needs to, and it does to some extent, but it needs to tap down expressions of political allegiance. It's got to be an apolitical organization, but that doesn't mean the cops, don't have their strong beliefs, and it doesn't mean they can't do their job in a fair and impartial way. But I don't want to say it is what it is, because it can change. But that is the reality of policing.
Right.
But then you get a majority, minority department in New York City. New York's an anomaly in many ways, but a bigger factor, I think, in New York City that I don't think people realize is what a large percentage of cops are immigrants and kids of immigrants, which is part of the reason I think the NYPD is better than other departments. So
they understand the constituency that they're dealing with.
I'm not even saying that, though. I think that is part of it. I'm actually saying they're overqualified for the job, that because of their background, their socioeconomic and immigrant background, they went to LaGuardia Community College, transferred to John Jay. These are New York City public colleges.
Yeah.
Their kids will be more likely to grow up, go to fancier private schools, and become doctors and lawyers, for better or for worse. The immigrants and kids of immigrants are trying to break into America's working class. It's a well-paid working class, but no one in their family has ever had a job with benefits, much less a pension. So it's a huge step up on social mobility, and to that extent, many of them objectively are overqualified. But it's great for New York City, and it's great for the NYPD, because you just get really smart, caring people often.
Right. I'm listening to you, and I thought back to a conversation I had a while back with two people from the Barred Prison Initiative. I'm sure you know. Do you know what that is?
Yeah.
So, great documentary on PBS, Prison Behind Bars, and one of the guests I had told me that, Stanley, you have to kind of begin to imagine a world without prisons, post prisons, and post policing. And in my mind, I've thought about that for the next couple of days after the podcast. And I go, but that's not possible. Like, I'm all for imagining a future that's maybe utopian, but this is like a little too much, don't you think?
No, it is too much. Now, I could imagine more easily a post-prison world.
Yeah, me too.
My second book, In Defense of Flogging, in some ways was a old-fashioned prison abolition book. But the key point was, you still need a form of punishment. It doesn't have to be prison. In theory, there could be some effective form that could be done a lot cheaper of, real home detention. It goes beyond anchor places. I don't know, but that's a topic for another time. But I think prisons are overused, and I think mass incarceration in America, I think, is a shame. Not a shame as unfortunate. I mean, our shame as a society to have 2 million people behind bars. No other country has come close, though China may now. That said, the idea of it's just imagining this utopian vision is first of all, in the near term, it's not going to happen. And the way to work towards it is to make things better, not it's just there's got the, I mean, especially at Bard College, the privilege of being able to say that, because they aren't at risk. The
Oh, okay.
abolition part goes,
Sorry. I'm going to interrupt you. The person that said it was actually a former inmate at
okay, that's
yeah.
different. I was thinking of a typical, if there is such a thing, of a Bard student. I mean, you know what I would do is, first of all, is tell me this vision. Like, I don't want to dismiss it out of hand. Some good can come from it. But just to talk the slogans isn't good enough. And that person I will listen to more because,
You lived it,
yeah, that, I mean, I respect that opinion a lot more.
right?
You know, um, eh, the police abolition part, and this goes back to defund. I mean, it's a bad slogan for many reasons. It was a bad slogan because it had to be explained because people couldn't agree on what it meant. And I think the vision is bad on top of it. What you said, you know, you're not going to, money isn't the magic answer, but you're not going to improve an organization by cutting its funds. We don't tell a school you underperform, so we're giving you 20% less money, get better. But what I think people don't realize who jumped on that slogan because it gained traction, it is rooted in police abolition. That was, defund was a way that they could, that they, you know, probably a bit to their surprise, got a lot of public attention and support, because they're like, well, who doesn't want to fund these other social programs more? And if that's all people defined it as, they could say they were defund supporters, but it is rooted, it's not a new idea, and it's rooted in the idea that police are the problem. And, you know, originally it came from a Marxist perspective and now sort of a more neo-Marxist perspective. But the idea that police are agents of state control and oppression, often now linked, which is one of my pet peeves, this false idea that police in New York City descended from slaves patrols, which is simply not true. And it's an odd hill to die on, but it matters to me because if you set the groundwork that police are an evil institution, it's a lot easier to defund the police.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we want to get rid of those vestiges of slavery and Jim Crow. Well, that's not the history of policing. Certainly not in the North, and it's more debatable in the South. But I would, you know, just for this focus on the North, it's just there's nothing, there's no truth to it, and now it's just stated as fact. You know, it was a documented time in American history. There are newspaper articles you can read online from the Library of Congress talking about the establishment of the new police. But it matters because if you see police as a noble concept that has committed harms and not been perfect, then you work to make it better. So that origin story, I mean, partly it's just, I think there's some parts of history that are not subjective, and that's one of them. But the origin story matters because it really frames the whole debate on whether police are a force for good or a force for evil.
Well, I think that's mostly within the kind of framework of the 1619 project, right? Like everything has as a
You could make
background
a
as
parallel to
yeah.
that. I don't want to take it too far, but there's some similarity. You know, is America founded on good ideals that we've been trying to strive for, or founded on bad ideals we've been overcoming?
Well, sorry, but one of the I believe it's been a while since I read all the essays, but one of the essays in the 1619 project was actually about the racial roots of policing. If I'm not mistaken, I could be mistaken, but I remember reading something along those lines.
Um, you know, so here, policing did not evolve. First of all, it was actually invented. Now, the word policing isn't new. So there were policing, you know,
Yeah.
goes back to the word to medieval times and the concept forever. Um, Policing is a verb. So you've had different groups that policed, and everything from, yeah, and the word had a broader meaning just to clean up an area, but to maintain order. Um, Robert Peel invented the first police department in 18, established really, but you know, the first police department in 1829 London. What he really invented was the concept of foot patrol, and it replaced a watchman system that was notoriously ineffective. And he set up explicitly in writing the idea the purpose of police is to maintain order, and prevent crime. That was the new concept. And the fact it was professional, it was full time, would be held accountable. So that's his contribution, a significant one, to the creation of policing. Came to America in 1845 to New York City first. Now, yeah, the other cities had sometimes what were called not often actually, but some Boston had a police department, but it was still set up in this sort of Watchman style of non-professionals, where you know somebody and they put you in a box at night, you fall asleep or you're drunk. Um, and the police that were established in New York City came from the London model. It was called the New Police. It was a it was a cool concept. Um, there was no talk about race. I also, I looked, and it's hard to do research and say I couldn't find anything because maybe I just didn't find it. But I actually went through all Frederick Douglass's newspapers from Rochester because he was writing at the time, and the Rochester, New York Police Department was established, I think, in the 1850s. But I'm not. But that's when it spread a lot. I was like, well, what did Frederick Douglass say when the Rochester Police Department was established? And the short answer is nothing, very little. It comes up occasionally in passing. If it was really he was not a man to hold back his words, and he was a strict abolitionist. If this was some imposition of slave culture, you think he would have mentioned it.
Right.
It simply wasn't. It's a lie that it was. A good argument, and look, history can be debated too. There are subjective parts to it. A strong argument can be made it was anti-immigrant nativist, but even that's more complicated because the immigrants ended up taking over, New York City politics and the police department. But there was a lot of, keeping those drunk Irish and the Catholics in line. That was explicitly said in newspapers, maybe not in those, well, actually sometimes in those words. So it's not that there was entirely a noble thing. And then in the South, during Reconstruction was when police departments were set up explicitly in opposition to slave catchers. Now all that fell apart when Reconstruction failed, and Jim Crow was implemented, and then police in the South did become racist instruments of a racist state. They reflected the racist laws of the time. When society is flawed, policing is flawed, and that goes to today. But the idea that it's rooted in this slave patrol is absurd. There's one caveat, by the way, because I've seen this. But yeah, as you can tell, I do think it's important to refute that for historical accuracy and greater contextualization. The Fugitive Slave Act, I'm just trying to think of the man's name. Might have been Ed Burns. God, there's no reason I should remember. But there was a big case in Boston where the Fugitive Slave Act was hugely unpopular and helped unify the North against the South and led to the Civil War. But it said that the local police departments, it says the slave catchers could catch slaves in northern states. And in as much as police were there in Boston, if I've read the contemporary accounts or contemporaneous accounts, it was a huge deal because this slave would run away and was being helped by abolitionists, was captured, and the Fugitive Slave Act, said, he's got to go back south, and they had to march him from the courthouse to a ship, and there were people with battering rams trying to free him, and it was a big deal. And the question was, what are the newly formed Boston police going to do? Are they going to? They were by and large against the Fugitive Slave Act personally, but the federal law was very clear, and they led him back to the ship. They reluctantly followed the fugitive slave law. Now, so that's part of American history that happened. That still doesn't make them descendants of slave catchers. But if you want to see police, if you see America as inherently flawed, trying to get better, or not trying to get better, let me say this: policing are as flawed as America is, and probably slightly less flawed, maybe in some ways. But if America is evil, then police represent that evil. I just disagree with that premise.
Right. So to begin wrapping up the conversation, I asked 2 questions of all my guests at the end of the podcast. I'm going to bundle them together. You answer in whatever order you please. The first one is, if you have any, what gives you hope for the future? It could be a very general hope or a specific, whatever you prefer. And the second question is, what are 5 books, fiction or nonfiction, that you would recommend to people?
Oh boy, what gives me hope for the future? Right now I'm pretty pessimistic. Do you mean in the grand scheme or in the world of what we've been talking about?
Oh, the grand scheme, if that's what gives you hope.
The kids give me hope for the future. I don't know. I mean, this is a weird way to say I have hope for the future, but all the problems we're having, we've always had problems. So in that sense, they're having problems is nothing new, and somehow we've managed to move forward and generally get better. Um, but I mean, it's not that I don't have hope for the future. I just don't think in terms of optimism enough, maybe.
It's
Um,
just hard to find hope for the future at the
yeah,
moment.
but I don't want to say I don't have hope for the future, but I don't know. I don't look at individual things um, and say, well, that gives me hope. Um, we'll see. And it's always a battle. It's always a struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah. I dodged an easy question.
No, no, that's fine. How about the
Puppies
book
give me hope for the future. I don't. Sorry, go on.
the book
Oh, the
rights?
books. Oh God, there's so many books. I'm looking at my police library here.
It could be,
Um,
by the way, it could be off the topic that we're talking about. It's just, books you would recommend to people.
um, well, there's it's funny. I just during the pandemic, I read through much of the Discworld series, which is better to be read if you were 16. But that's not actually what I recommend. But I did just finish that. What are my favorite books? Well, Birds Without Wings comes to mind. Where's a Birds Without Feathers? I don't know why that one sticks with me. These are old. Bridge on the Drina. I tend to like books that have a historical element to it, historical fiction. The Moor's Last Sigh, that's a good one. Um, and slightly more than what we've been talking about, there's an old book by Fox Butterfield, a New York Times journalist. What the hell is it called? All God's Children, I believe, which follows the case of Willie Bosket, who's the longest serving man in solitary confinement in New York City, and goes back to follows his family back to antebellum days, and doesn't excuse his actions, but kind of says, should we be surprised? Just shows how trauma gets transmitted through the generations. Um, I loved Moby Dick. I like all those books about, well, Moby Dick being fiction, but I love all the nonfiction books about adventurers, whalers going to the Arctic and,
Hmm.
ending in terrible disasters and hiking across Siberia. I liked Hampton Sides books on Kit Carson and trains. I don't think he's written one recently though. I do read a lot, and especially I've read a lot uh, lately. Um, yeah, people should read more.
Yeah.
I find people are reading less, at least like that I come across. Um,
Oh,
what are your
oh, you want to reverse it at me?
yeah, what books do you recommend?
Oh God. It's easier to ask a question than to answer it, right?
Yeah.
Uh, I guess I've been trying to read fiction more often. So, um,
Oh, I'm sorry. You can
no,
keep thinking. Boy, did I like City in the City. Was good. Um, that was fiction. Um, uh, The Man Who Loved Dogs, which is a book about Trotsky. It's pretty historical, but it is technically fiction about his life. It's translated from, I don't know, from Spanish originally. I will say this about fiction: I tend to focus on nonfiction because even if the book isn't great, I'm still learning something.
me too.
Or if I'm reading a novel, it better be good, God damn it. So my standards are higher.
I think I'm the same way because there was a period of time when I was like 15, 16, my dad used to say, Stanley, you should read fiction. Like this is your time to read fiction. And I was like, yeah, whatever. And I was like, I have my whole life to do that. But now I'm like at a certain age where I just want to learn things. And the only place I can learn things is through reading nonfiction. But from the fiction, I will always recommend Stoner by John Williams.
Mhm.
I found that book a couple of years ago, and I thought it was one of the greatest books I've ever read. Uh, oh, you got more.
No, I just Googled. I said Moore's Last Sigh. I haven't read Moore's Last Sigh. That's a Salman Rushdie book. Or maybe I'd read it. It's not what I'm thinking of. There's a great book about um in like 17th century Florida, there was a real shipwreck. And there's the only written account of it is this man who went ashore with his Moor. Well, in real life, 10 years later, they show up, or many years later, they show up in Mexico City. And boy, and so the book fills in the gap. We don't know. But we do know like that they became slaves, that they became mystic faith healers, and they walked overland in this, I think in the 1600s, from Florida to Mexico City. But I can't think of the name of the book, but man, is it good.
Mm. I actually, as many times as I've asked this question, I've never thought about my answer. So, good on you for asking. I have to maybe compile it one day.
Give me a few more. Come on.
Oh, a few more. Okay.
Yeah.
Stoner, John Williams. I read The Shallows. It's by a man named Nicholas Carr about the effect of the internet on people's brains. I thought it was really good. Volume 1 of the Lyndon Johnson biographies by
Oh, I have
Robert
not delved
Caro.
into that.
It was really good.
Oh, here's a good nonfiction. I actually just recently, I want to have a fake bookshelf of just The Power Broker. I read it. It was good. But what's great is the book Gotham, History of New York City. There's a second. Yeah, the first volume, I read the second. It's outstanding. The first one is better. And it's one of those thick books that is heavy, but I found it a real page turner. Anything by Jane Jacobs is great, and I'm not just talking about Death and Life of Great American Cities. Her other books are, I would say, undervalued and underread. She was a very eclectic thinker, but yeah, deserving of the respect she has.
I mean, I asked for 5. I think you gave me like 10, which is great.
Well, because I'm always so like the question is the first 5 I think of, but I'm trying to think of like ones that I actually remember from a long time ago. I mean, looking over there's Roots by Alex Haley, but I read that in high school. But it's a damn good book, no doubt about it. Yeah. My books, gotta throw in those. Everyone has to read Cop in the Hood in Defense of Flogging and Greek
I'm gonna link them down in my description for my YouTube and Spotify and everything. So, but I do want to begin wrapping up and say thank you for coming onto the podcast and for speaking with me, taking the time to talk about a very serious issue, in my opinion, and one that I think people should have more maybe nuanced views on. If you have something to plug, feel free to plug it beyond your books.
Well, I guess I'm really bad at plugging stuff, but I less than a year ago, I reached out to pretty much everyone I know and said, okay, given that violence has gone up, 30% overnight, what can we do to reduce violence? And it's mostly from a police perspective, though not entirely. But it's my violence reduction project, but it's a collection of essays. And the thing is, I don't want you to reimagine things. I'm not talking about a long-term solution. I want to know now. Violence went up quickly, it can go down quickly. What do we need to do? And it's dare I say, I think it's a good compilation of like almost 36 essays. And you can link to it if you go to qualitypolicing.com. You can get to those collection of essays. I hope some good comes from it, because partly I wondered, like, what can I do? I guess I said, well, I can write and ask other writers to help. And then there's a podcast there too, which goes in spurts. I don't do it regularly, but that's also at qualitypolicing.com. But I like to think that they're good interviews as well. So people can check that out if they're interested.
For sure. Thank you again, and I hope to do it again in the future.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks.